Lynn walked across the university campus with her head down, clutching a stack of books to her chest. The autumn leaves crunched under her shoes as other students rushed past, laughing and talking about weekend plans. Lynn barely noticed them. Her mind was still working through a problem from her morning calculus class, numbers and formulas dancing behind her eyes. Lynn wasn't what most people would call remarkable. At 20 years old, she was shorter than average, with long black hair usually tied back in a simple ponytail. She wore the same 3 sweaters in rotation and lived off instant noodles and coffee. What made her different wasn't visible from the outside. It was the way her brain worked, especially when it came to numbers. The daughter of Chinese immigrants who ran a small grocery store on the edge of town, Lynn had grown up counting inventory and calculating prices. Her parents worked 14-hour days to give her opportunities they never had. When Lynn earned a partial scholarship to State University, her mother had cried with pride while her father had simply nodded, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You're going to do something amazing," her mother had told her. "I can feel it." But 2 years into her mathematics degree, Lynn hadn't done anything amazing yet. She got good grades, sure, but she wasn't a standout student. She was too shy to raise her hand in class, too awkward to make many friends. She spent most evenings in the library, finding comfort in the orderly world of equations where everything had a solution if you just found the right approach. That Thursday afternoon, Lynn headed to her favorite spot on the 3rd floor of the university library. It was tucked behind the ancient mathematics journals that hardly anyone ever touched. There was a small desk by a window overlooking the quad, and if she got there early enough, it was usually empty. Today, she was lucky. Lynn spread out her books and notebooks, creating her own little universe of papers and formulas. She had 3 hours before her part-time job at the campus coffee shop. 3 hours to lose herself in numbers. She was halfway through her homework when Professor Rivera walked by. He was carrying a stack of dusty journals and seemed surprised to find anyone in this forgotten corner of the library. "Working hard, I see," he said, pausing by her table. Lynn nodded, suddenly nervous. Professor Rivera taught her advanced calculus class and had a reputation for being brilliant, but demanding. He had white hair that stood up in all directions and always wore the same style of plaid shirt with elbow patches. Students joked that he was like a walking math stereotype, but Lynn had always found him kind beneath his gruff exterior. "Yes, sir," she managed to say, "just finishing the homework." Professor Rivera glanced at her notes and raised his eyebrows. "That's an interesting approach," he said, pointing to her work. "Most students don't visualize the problem that way." Lynn looked down at her notebook. She had drawn a series of spiraling patterns alongside the equations. That was how math had always looked in her head. Not just numbers and symbols, but shapes and colors and patterns that moved and changed. "I always picture math problems," she admitted quietly. "It helps me understand them better." Instead of finding this strange, Professor Rivera looked intrigued. He put down his stack of journals and pulled out the chair across from her. "Visual thinking in mathematics is more common than most people realize," he said. "Einstein used to do thought experiments where he visualized himself riding alongside a beam of light. Sometimes seeing a problem differently is exactly what's needed to solve it." Lynn hadn't known that about Einstein. She'd always felt a little embarrassed about her way of thinking, as if it wasn't rigorous enough for real math. Professor Rivera picked up one of her notebooks, flipping through the pages with interest. "You have a natural talent for pattern recognition," he said. "Have you ever considered focusing on number theory?" Lynn shook her head. She didn't know much about number theory beyond what she'd learned in her introductory classes. "It might suit your way of thinking," the professor continued. "Some of the most interesting unsolved problems in mathematics live in that field." Something in his voice caught Lynn's attention. She looked up from her homework. "Like what kind of problems?" she asked. Professor Rivera leaned back in his chair, his eyes lighting up the way they did when he was about to explain something he found fascinating. "Well, there's the famous Riemann conjecture, for example," he said. "It's been unsolved for nearly 70 years now. Some of the brightest minds in mathematics have tried and failed to crack it. What makes it so hard?" Lynn asked, her curiosity piqued. "It deals with the distribution patterns of prime numbers," Professor Rivera explained. "On the surface, it seems relatively straightforward, but it's devilishly complex when you dig deeper. Klaus Riemann proposed it back in the mid-1950s, and people have been banging their heads against it ever since." Lynn found herself leaning forward, intrigued. What would happen if someone solved it? Professor Rivera smiled. It would revolutionize several fields, particularly cryptography. Our modern encryption systems rely heavily on prime number properties. A solution to the Reichmann conjecture could lead to more secure systems, or possibly break existing ones. That's why so many people have tried to solve it, have you? Lynn asked before she could stop herself. The professor chuckled. I've spent my fair share of late nights on it. So has every other mathematician worth their salt. But after a while, most of us move on to more attainable goals. He sighed, then brightened. But that's the beauty of mathematics. Sometimes a fresh perspective is all that's needed. The person who eventually solves it might be someone who doesn't know it's supposed to be impossible. With that, Professor Rivera stood up and gathered his journals. Don't stay too late, Lynn. Even brilliant minds need rest. After he left, Lynn tried to return to her homework, but her thoughts kept drifting to what the professor had said about the Reichmann conjecture. She opened her laptop and typed it into the search bar. The results were intimidating. Dozens of academic papers, all filled with complex notation and terminology she didn't fully understand yet. But instead of feeling discouraged, Lynn felt a strange excitement building. She started taking notes, drawing her spiral patterns as she tried to grasp the fundamental concepts. Before she knew it, 2 hours had passed. She was going to be late for work if she didn't hurry. Lynn packed up her things quickly, but as she zipped her backpack, she made a decision. She would check out some of those dusty journals in the section where Professor Rivera had been browsing. Maybe they contained articles about the conjecture that weren't available online. That night, after her shift at the coffee shop ended at 10 p.m., Lynn returned to her small off-campus apartment exhausted but unable to sleep. Her roommate Tasha was spending the night at her boyfriend's place, so Lynn had the tiny living room to herself. She spread her books across their second-hand coffee table and began reading about Klaus Reichmann and his famous conjecture. The more she read, the more fascinated she became. The conjecture itself was elegant in its simplicity, yet the implications were profound. She could see why it had captivated mathematicians for decades. As she read, Lynn started drawing her own visual representations of the problem, creating swirling patterns that filled page after page of her notebook. At some point, she must have fallen asleep on the couch because she woke with a start at 3 a.m., her neck stiff and a page from her notebook stuck to her cheek. Lynn peeled it off and stared at the patterns she'd drawn hours earlier. Something about them tugged at her mind, like a word on the tip of her tongue. She felt like she was seeing something important, but couldn't quite grasp what it was. Lynn dragged herself to bed, but even in her dreams, numbers and patterns swirled around her. When her alarm went off at 7 a.m., she woke with the feeling that she'd been working all night. Over the next few weeks, Lynn fell into a new routine. She attended classes, did her required coursework, and worked her coffee shop shifts. But every spare moment was devoted to the Reichmann conjecture. She started skipping meals, losing track of time in the library, and filling notebook after notebook with calculations and drawings. Tasha noticed the change in her roommate's behavior first. "Are you okay?" she asked one evening, finding Lynn surrounded by papers covered in strange spiral patterns. "You haven't left this spot since I went to class this morning. Have you eaten anything?" Lynn looked up, blinking as if she'd forgotten where she was. "I'm fine," she said. "Just working on something interesting." "More interesting than food or sleep?" Tasha asked, concerned. "Because you're starting to worry me." Lynn hadn't realized how her obsession was affecting her. She agreed to take a break and join Tasha for dinner at the campus dining hall, but her mind kept drifting back to the problem. While Tasha talked about her psychology professor's weird grading system, Lynn was mentally testing different approaches to the conjecture. Professor Rivera noticed the change too. Lynn's homework was still getting done, but her focus in class had shifted. She would stare out the window with a distant expression, then suddenly scribble frantically in her notebook, but not always about the topic being discussed. After class one day, he asked her to stay behind. "Lynn, is everything all right?" he asked when the other students had left. "You seem distracted lately." Lynn hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out one of her notebooks. "I've been thinking about what you told me," she admitted. "About the Reichmann conjecture." Professor Rivera's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "You've been working on the conjecture? That's quite ambitious for an undergraduate." I know it's probably silly, Lynn said quickly. I mean, if all these famous mathematicians couldn't solve it, how could I? But I can't stop thinking about it. The professor took her notebook and flipped through the pages, his expression changing from skepticism to interest. This is a very unique approach, he said slowly. I've never seen anyone visualize the problem quite this way. Lynn felt a flutter of hope. Do you think it could work? Professor Rivera handed the notebook back carefully. I honestly don't know, but I've learned never to discourage curiosity. He paused. Just promise me you'll still pay attention in class and take care of yourself. Brilliant insights rarely come to exhausted, malnourished brains, Lynn promised, but as she left his office, she already knew she would be back in the library that evening, adding more pages to her growing collection of notebooks filled with spirals and patterns and numbers that danced across the page. Like living things, what Lynn didn't know was that she had already taken the first step on a path that would eventually lead her to the impossible and change the world of mathematics forever. 3 months into her obsession with the Reichman conjecture, Lynn's life had changed completely. Her once tidy desk had disappeared under stacks of books, journals, and dozens of notebooks filled with her distinctive spiral patterns. Her walls were covered with large sheets of paper where she'd tried to map out different approaches to the problem. Even her dreams were filled with numbers and patterns, swirling and shifting like living things. Tasha had gone from concerned to genuinely worried about her roommate. You missed dinner with your parents last weekend, she said one morning, finding Lynn already awake and working at their small kitchen table. Your mom called me because you weren't answering your phone. Lynn looked up, guilt washing over her face. I forgot, she admitted. I was working and lost track of time. For 2 days? Tasha crossed her arms. Lynn, this isn't healthy. When was the last time you slept for more than 4 hours, or ate something that wasn't coffee or instant noodles? Lynn couldn't remember. The days had begun blurring together, marked only by her classes, work shifts, and the endless hours spent trying to solve the impossible equation. She'd dropped one of her elective courses to free up more time for research, and her grades in other classes were slipping. I'm onto something, Tasha, Lynn said quietly. I can feel it. There's a pattern here that nobody else has seen. Tasha sighed and put a hand on Lynn's shoulder. I believe you, but you won't solve anything if you make yourself sick in the process. Promise me you'll come to the dining hall for dinner tonight? Real food with actual vegetables? Lynn nodded reluctantly. I promise. But when dinner time came, Lynn was deep in the library stacks, hunting for a paper by a French mathematician who had attempted a similar approach to the conjecture in the 1980s. By the time she found it and looked at her watch, it was nearly midnight. The dining hall had closed hours ago. The next morning, Professor Rivera asked Lynn to stay after class again. Your test scores are dropping, he said without preamble, sliding her latest calculus exam across the desk. The red C at the top made Lynn wince. And Professor Chen tells me you've been sleeping through his number theory lectures. Lynn stared at the floor. I'm sorry. I've been focused on my research. The Reichman conjecture. It wasn't a question. Yes. Professor Rivera sighed deeply. Lynn, I'm partly responsible for this. I shouldn't have mentioned the conjecture to you. It's eaten up years of too many mathematicians' lives. Lynn looked up, suddenly afraid he would try to stop her. Please don't tell me to give it up. I'm making progress. The professor studied her face carefully. There were dark circles under her eyes and she'd lost weight. But there was also an intensity in her gaze that gave him pause. Show me, he said finally. Lynn pulled out her latest notebook and opened it to a page covered with a complex pattern of interlocking spirals and equations. I've been thinking about prime number distribution from a different angle. Everyone approaches it linearly. But what if we consider it as a multidimensional pattern? Professor Rivera took the notebook and examined it closely, his brow furrowed. After several minutes of silence, he looked up with an expression Lynn couldn't read. This is unorthodox, he said slowly, but there might be something here. Hope flared in Lynn's chest. You think so? I think you need to talk to Dr. Patel in the physics department. Your approach has elements that remind me of some work being done in quantum field theory. He handed back the notebook. But Lynn, you can't keep going like this. Your health is suffering and so is your education. The conjecture is part of my education, Lynn argued. Maybe the most important part. Professor Rivera shook his head. Mathematics is a marathon, not a sprint. The great problems aren't solved in weeks or months. Sometimes it takes decades. You need to pace yourself. Lynn knew he was right, but the idea of slowing down made her anxious. The patterns in her head felt so close to clicking into place. If she stepped away now, she might lose the thread entirely. "I'll try," she said, not entirely convincingly. Professor Rivera didn't look satisfied, but he wrote down Dr. Patel's office hours on a slip of paper and handed it to her. "Start by talking to her, and please get some sleep before you do." Lynn nodded and left, clutching her notebook close to her chest. On her way out of the building, she nearly collided with Dr. Williams, the department chair. He was a tall, stern man with wire-rimmed glasses who rarely interacted with undergraduates. "Ms. Jiang," he said, recognizing her. "Professor Rivera has mentioned your extracurricular interests." Lynn felt her face grow warm. Had Professor Rivera been discussing her work with others in the department? "I'm just exploring some ideas," she said cautiously. Dr. Williams adjusted his glasses. "The Reichman conjecture has been the downfall of many promising careers. It's a beautiful problem, but it may well be unsolvable with our current understanding of mathematics. Or maybe it just needs a different perspective," Lynn suggested, then immediately regretted her boldness. To her surprise, Dr. Williams didn't seem offended. "Perhaps, but I would hate to see a talented student like yourself burn out chasing an impossible dream when there are so many worthy problems within reach." He paused. Just some food for thought. As he walked away, Lynn felt a flash of irritation. Why did everyone assume the problem was beyond her abilities? Yes, she was just an undergraduate. Yes, brilliant mathematicians had failed to solve it. But what if they had all been looking at it wrong? What if her unusual way of seeing patterns was exactly what was needed? The next day, Lynn visited Dr. Patel during her office hours. The physics professor was younger than Lynn expected, with a quick smile and hands that moved expressively when she talked. "Rivera mentioned you might stop by," she said, clearing a stack of papers from a chair. "Something about an unusual approach to the Reichman conjecture?" Lynn nodded and hesitantly opened her notebook. "I've been trying to visualize the problem differently. Professor Rivera thought it had some connection to quantum field theory." Dr. Patel looked at Lynn's drawings with growing interest. "These patterns, they do remind me of quantum probability distributions." She flipped through more pages. "You're essentially creating a visual model of prime number behavior in multiple dimensions." "Yes." Lynn felt a surge of excitement that someone else could see what she was trying to do. "Everyone treats primes as just numbers on a line, but what if they're points in a larger pattern? A pattern with rules we haven't recognized yet because we're looking at it from the wrong angle." For the next hour, Lynn and Dr. Patel discussed the possible connections between Lynn's approach and various physics concepts. Dr. Patel pulled books from her shelves and scribbled equations on her whiteboard. By the time Lynn left, she had 3 new books under her arm and a head buzzing with fresh ideas. That evening, Lynn called her parents and apologized for missing dinner. Her mother sounded relieved just to hear her voice. "We worry about you," she said in Mandarin. "Your roommate says you're working too hard on some math problem." "It's important, Mom," Lynn tried to explain. "If I can solve this, it could change everything." There was a pause before her mother responded. "Just remember to take care of yourself. No problem is worth your health." Lynn promised she would rest more and eat better. After hanging up, she actually felt hungry for the first time in days. She walked to the small Chinese restaurant near campus and ordered her favorite dish, twice cooked pork with rice. As she ate, she couldn't help jotting down ideas on a napkin, but she made herself focus on enjoying the food too. Back at her apartment, Tasha looked surprised to see Lynn return before midnight. "You're home early," she said, "and you look like you've actually eaten something with nutrients." Lynn smiled sheepishly. "I'm trying to do better. You and Professor Rivera are right. I need to take care of myself if I want to solve this thing." Tasha looked relieved. "Does this mean I can stop worrying about finding you passed out face down in your notebooks?" "Hopefully," Lynn said. "But I'm not giving up on the conjecture." "I wouldn't expect you to," Tasha replied. "Just maybe don't let it consume your entire life." That night, Lynn actually slept for 7 hours straight. When she woke, her mind felt clearer than it had in weeks. She made coffee and sat by her window, watching students cross the quad on their way to morning classes. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to think about something other than the Reichman conjecture. But the break didn't last long. As she sipped her coffee, Lynn's eyes drifted to the pattern of raindrops on the window. They formed irregular dots on the glass, each one distorting the light in tiny ways. Something about the pattern triggered a thought. Lynn put down her cup and grabbed a notebook. What if prime numbers were like those raindrops, not just points on a line but distortions in a field? Each one affecting the space around it in ways that created larger patterns. She began drawing frantically, trying to capture the idea before it slipped away. By the time she had to leave for class, she'd filled 10 pages with new equations and spiral patterns. In her number theory lecture that morning, Lynn actually paid attention. Professor Chen was discussing properties of prime numbers that might be relevant to her work. She asked questions, took detailed notes, and even stayed after class to clarify a point about distribution patterns. Professor Chen seemed pleased by her renewed engagement. "It's good to see you taking an interest again," he said. "Professor Rivera mentioned you've been working on some independent research." Lynn nodded, wondering just how many faculty members knew about her obsession with the Reichmann conjecture. "I'd be happy to discuss your ideas sometime," Professor Chen offered. "My dissertation was on prime number theory, though I never tackled Reichmann directly." Lynn thanked him and added his perspective to the growing list of resources she was consulting. Over the next few weeks, she developed a more balanced approach to her research. She attended classes regularly, ate proper meals, and even joined Tasha for a movie night. But she still spent most of her free time working on the conjecture, filling notebook after notebook with increasingly complex patterns. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Lynn was riding the bus back to campus after visiting her parents at their store. She'd helped them with inventory, and had a bag of homemade dumplings her mother had insisted she take back to share with Tasha. Lynn was staring absently at the raindrops racing down the window when something clicked in her mind. The way the drops merged and created new paths, changing the overall pattern while following simple physical laws. It was the same principle she'd been trying to apply to the Reichmann conjecture, but suddenly she saw a connection she'd missed before. The rain wasn't just a metaphor. It was a physical example of the mathematical principle she was trying to describe. Lynn pulled out her notebook with shaking hands and began writing frantically. The equations flowed from her pen as if they'd been waiting to be discovered. She was vaguely aware of missing her stop, of the bus continuing on its route, but she couldn't stop writing. Everything was connecting: her visual patterns, Dr. Patel's quantum field ideas, and a musical theory concept she'd read about involving harmonics and overtones. By the time Lynn realized where she was, the bus had reached the end of its route at the mall on the edge of town. The driver had to call back to her twice before she looked up. "End of the line, miss." Lynn gathered her things and stepped off the bus in a daze. She'd have to catch one going back to campus, but she didn't mind. She needed time to process what had just happened. Standing under the bus shelter, protected from the rain, Lynn reviewed what she'd written. The approach was unorthodox, combining visual pattern recognition with concepts from physics and music theory that most mathematicians would never think to connect. But the equations balanced, the logic held. She'd created a mathematical bridge across a gap that had seemed uncrossable. Lynn caught the next bus back to campus and headed straight for Professor Rivera's office. It was past his office hours, but she saw light under his door and knocked urgently. When he opened the door, Professor Rivera looked surprised to see her standing there soaking wet, clutching her notebook. "Lynn, what's happened?" "I think I've done it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I've solved the Reichmann conjecture." Professor Rivera stared at Lynn for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Rain dripped from her hair onto the worn carpet of his office doorway. "Come in," he said finally, stepping aside. "You're soaked." Lynn entered the small office cluttered with books and papers. The walls were lined with shelves overflowing with mathematical journals, and a whiteboard covered in equations took up one entire wall. Professor Rivera cleared a stack of papers from a chair. "Sit," he said, "and tell me exactly what you mean by solved it." Lynn sat down, cradling her damp notebook protectively. Now that she was here in the fluorescent light of his office, doubt began to creep in. What if she was wrong? What if she'd made a basic error somewhere? The mathematical world was littered with the remains of supposed solutions to famous problems that had fallen apart under scrutiny. I think I found an approach that works," she said, her voice smaller now. "It came to me while I was watching raindrops on a bus window. Professor Rivera's eyebrows rose, but he didn't laugh or dismiss her. Instead, he pulled his chair closer. "Show me," he said simply. With trembling hands, Lynn opened her notebook to the pages she'd filled on the bus. The paper was slightly wrinkled from the damp, but her writing was still clear. She began explaining her approach, starting with the visual patterns she'd been developing for months and then showing how they connected to the breakthrough she'd had that afternoon. "See, everyone tries to approach the conjecture linearly, looking at the distribution of primes along a number line. But what if we visualize it as a multi-dimensional pattern? Like ripples in a pond, each prime creates disturbances in the mathematical field around it." She flipped to another page, showing a complex diagram that looked somewhat like a musical score overlaid with fractal patterns. Then I realized there was a connection to harmonic theory. The way musical overtones relate to one another follows patterns that are mathematically similar to prime number distributions. And when you combine that with ideas from quantum field theory, Lynn talked for nearly an hour, the words pouring out of her in an excited rush. Professor Rivera listened intently, occasionally asking a question or pointing to a section of her work for clarification. His expression gave nothing away, no excitement, no dismissal, just focused concentration. When Lynn finally finished, the office fell silent. Professor Rivera leaned back in his chair, removed his glasses, and rubbed his eyes tiredly. "Lynn," he said at last, "what you've shown me is highly unusual." Lynn's heart sank. "You think I'm wrong?" "I didn't say that." The professor put his glasses back on and looked at her directly. "Your approach combines elements from fields that rarely intersect in mathematical research. It's unorthodox, to say the least. But does it work?" Lynn asked, leaning forward. Professor Rivera sighed. "I honestly don't know. Parts of it seem sound, but I'm not qualified to evaluate all aspects of your approach. The physics elements, particularly the quantum field theory connections, are outside my expertise." He paused. "And that's the challenge you're going to face. Your solution crosses so many disciplinary boundaries that no single person may be able to verify it completely." Lynn hadn't considered this problem. In her excitement, she'd imagined presenting her solution and having it immediately recognized for its brilliance. The reality, as Professor Rivera was gently suggesting, would be much more complicated. "So what do I do now?" she asked. "First, we need to get your work in front of people with expertise in these different areas." He glanced at his watch. "It's too late to call anyone now, but tomorrow I'll reach out to Dr. Patel in physics and Dr. Lee in music theory. Maybe also Dr. Rodriguez, who specializes in computational approaches to number theory." Lynn nodded, trying to process this. Do you think there's a real chance I've solved it?" Professor Rivera looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Yes," he said finally. "There's a chance. Your approach is so different from anything I've seen before that it just might work, where conventional methods have failed. But Lynn," he added, his voice gentler now, "you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that there's a flaw somewhere. Even if the basic insight is correct, the details might need refinement." "I understand," Lynn said, though the thought of finding an error in her solution made her stomach clench. "Take this home and make a clean copy," Professor Rivera said, handing back her damp notebook. "We'll meet tomorrow with some colleagues and go through it step by step." Lynn nodded and gathered her things. As she reached the door, Professor Rivera called after her. "Lynn, whatever happens with this work, what you've done is already remarkable. Not many undergraduates would even attempt the Reichman conjecture, let alone develop such an innovative approach." His words stayed with Lynn as she walked back to her apartment through the rain. "Whatever happens," the phrase echoed in her mind. She had been so focused on solving the problem that she hadn't thought much about what would come after. If her solution held up under scrutiny, how would it change her life? And if it didn't, if there was a fatal flaw somewhere, could she bear the disappointment? When Lynn reached her apartment, Tasha was studying at the kitchen table. She looked up as Lynn entered, dripping water onto the floor. "Where have you been? You're soaked." Then, noticing Lynn's expression, "What happened? Are you okay?" "I think I solved it," Lynn said, her voice barely audible over the sound of rain on the windows. "The Reichman conjecture. I think I actually solved it." Tasha's eyes widened. "For real? The impossible math thing you've been obsessing over?" Lynn nodded. a mix of excitement and terror washing over her. Professor Rivera is setting up a meeting tomorrow with other professors to go over my work. That's amazing. Tasha jumped up and gave Lynn a hug, then pulled back quickly. You're freezing. Go change into dry clothes before you catch pneumonia. I want to hear everything, but not at the cost of your health. Lynn smiled weakly and went to her room. As she changed into dry clothes, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. She looked different somehow, her eyes bright with a feverish intensity, her face thinner than it had been months ago when she'd first heard about the conjecture. The girl who had walked into Professor Rivera's calculus class last semester seemed like a stranger now. Back in the kitchen, Lynn found that Tasha had made her a cup of hot tea and heated up the dumplings her mother had given her earlier. Eat, Tasha commanded. Then tell me everything. Lynn ate gratefully, suddenly realizing how hungry she was. Between bites, she tried to explain her breakthrough in terms Tasha might understand. It wasn't easy. Tasha was a psychology major who freely admitted that math beyond basic statistics made her head hurt. But she listened attentively, nodding encouragingly even when Lynn used terms like multidimensional prime distribution patterns and harmonic field resonance. So basically, Tasha said when Lynn finished, you looked at this super hard math problem in a way nobody ever thought to look at it before, and that might be why you solved it when all these famous math geniuses couldn't. Lynn smiled. That's actually a pretty good summary. Well, I'm not surprised, Tasha said, gathering up the empty plates. You've always seen things differently. Remember when you figured out how to rearrange our furniture so we could fit in that extra bookshelf that supposedly wouldn't fit? Everyone else was looking at the room as a rectangle with fixed dimensions, but you somehow saw that if we turned everything at these weird angles, it created this whole new space. Lynn hadn't thought about that incident in ages, but Tasha was right. She had always had a knack for seeing spatial relationships that others missed. Maybe that same ability, applied to the abstract spaces of mathematics, had led her to this breakthrough. That night, Lynn carefully copied her work into a fresh notebook, refining her explanations and clarifying her diagrams. Despite her exhaustion, her mind was too wired to sleep. What would happen tomorrow? Would her solutions stand up to expert scrutiny? Or would they find a fundamental flaw that collapsed her entire approach? The next morning, Lynn skipped her classes and went straight to Professor Rivera's office. He had arranged a meeting with 3 other professors, Dr. Patel from physics, Dr. Lee from music theory, and Dr. Rodriguez from computational mathematics. They gathered in a small conference room with Lynn's notebooks and diagrams spread out on the table. For the next 4 hours, Lynn explained her approach while the professors asked questions, raised concerns, and debated among themselves. At times, the discussion became technical enough that Lynn struggled to follow it, especially when Dr. Patel and Dr. Rodriguez argued about the implications of quantum field theory for number pattern recognition. Dr. Lee, a soft-spoken woman with silver-streaked hair, was particularly interested in Lynn's use of harmonic theory. This connection to musical overtones is fascinating, she said, examining one of Lynn's diagrams. It reminds me of some work being done in geometric approaches to music theory, but I've never seen it applied to prime number distribution before. By mid-afternoon, Lynn was mentally exhausted. The professors had found several points in her work that needed clarification or further development, but they hadn't identified any fatal flaws. When they finally broke for the day, Professor Rivera pulled Lynn aside. This is promising, he said quietly. Very promising. But we need more time to verify all aspects of your approach, and eventually we'll need to prepare a formal paper for submission to a journal. Lynn nodded, too tired to fully process the implications. What happens next? Dr. Rodriguez has offered to run some computational tests on your model. That will take a few days. In the meantime, Dr. Patel and Dr. Lee will review the aspects related to their fields. He paused. And Lynn, you should go back to your regular classes. Try to catch up on what you've missed. This process will take time. Lynn wanted to protest. How could she focus on routine coursework now? But she recognized the wisdom in his advice. The verification process was out of her hands for the moment, and she had neglected her other studies for too long. The next week was surreal. Lynn attended classes, completed assignments, and tried to act normal, while her mind constantly drifted to the conference room where her work was being evaluated. Her fellow students had no idea that she might have solved one of mathematics' most notorious problems. In the dining hall on the quad, in the library, life went on as usual while Lynn existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting. Professor Rivera kept her updated on the progress. Dr. Rodriguez's computational tests were showing promising results. Dr. Patel had consulted with colleagues at other universities about the quantum aspects of Lynn's approach. Dr. Lee had found intriguing connections between Lynn's use of harmonic theory and recent work in the field. 10 days after her rainy epiphany on the bus, Lynn was called back to the conference room. All 4 professors were there, along with Dr. Williams, the department chair. Lynn's heart hammered in her chest as she took a seat. Professor Rivera spoke first. "Lynn, we've spent the past week and a half rigorously examining your approach to the Reichmann conjecture from multiple angles. We've tested it computationally, consulted with colleagues in relevant fields, and scrutinized every aspect of your mathematical reasoning." He paused, and Lynn held her breath. "While there are still some details to refine, and the formal proof will require additional work, we believe you've done it. You've found a valid solution to the Reichmann conjecture." The room seemed to spin around Lynn. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "Really?" she whispered. "You're sure?" Dr. Rodriguez nodded emphatically. "My computational tests confirm that your model accurately predicts prime distribution patterns to a degree that can't be coincidental. The math checks out. The quantum field approach you've developed is genuinely innovative," Dr. Patel added. "I've consulted with 2 colleagues who specialize in this area, and they agree that your application of these principles to number theory opens up entirely new possibilities." Dr. Lee smiled warmly. "And your use of harmonic theory as a bridge between these different mathematical domains is nothing short of brilliant. It's an approach that simply wouldn't occur to most mathematicians, which is probably why the conjecture remained unsolved for so long." Dr. Williams leaned forward. His usually stern face softened with what might have been respect. "Ms. Zhang, what you've accomplished here is extraordinary. Not just solving the conjecture, but doing so in a way that creates new connections between mathematical fields that have traditionally been separate." Lynn looked around at their faces, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "So what happens now?" "Now," said Professor Rivera, "we prepare your work for publication. The Journal of Advanced Mathematical Theory would be the most appropriate venue. And we'll need to present your findings at the International Mathematics Conference in June." "That's only 2 months away," Lynn said, suddenly nervous at the thought of presenting her work to the world's leading mathematicians. "Which gives us just enough time to prepare," Professor Rivera replied. "You and I will work together on refining the formal proof. Dr. Patel, Dr. Lee, and Dr. Rodriguez have all offered to contribute sections relevant to their expertise. And I'll handle the politics," Dr. Williams added. "Make no mistake, Ms. Zhang, your solution will face intense scrutiny from the mathematical community. Some will resist simply because you're an undergraduate, or because your approach challenges conventional thinking. My job will be to ensure your work gets the fair hearing it deserves." Lynn nodded, feeling overwhelmed by the support these professors were offering. "Thank you. All of you. I couldn't have done this without your guidance." "Oh, I think you would have found your way there eventually," Dr. Lee said with a smile, "but we're glad to help speed the journey." As the meeting broke up, Professor Rivera walked Lynn back to his office. "You should call your parents," he said. "They'll want to know what their daughter has accomplished." Lynn nodded, trying to imagine how she would explain this to her parents. They had always supported her education, but the significance of solving the Reichmann conjecture would be difficult to convey. "Professor," she said hesitantly, "what does this mean? For my future, I mean." Professor Rivera considered the question carefully before answering. "It means doors will open for you. Graduate programs, research opportunities, possibly even job offers from tech companies or government agencies interested in the cryptographic applications of your work." He smiled slightly. "It means your life is about to change, Lynn. Are you ready for that?" Lynn thought about the shy, quiet student she had been just months ago, before the Reichmann conjecture had taken over her life. That girl seemed very far away now. "I think so," she said, surprising herself with the confidence in her voice. "Yes, I'm ready." As Lynn walked across campus toward her apartment, the late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the quad. Students hurried past, heading to classes or dinner or study groups, unaware that the impossible had just become possible in a small conference room behind them. Lynn stopped for a moment, tilting her face up to feel the warmth of the sun. For the first time since she'd begun working on the conjecture, her mind was quiet, no equations spinning, no patterns demanding to be recognized. Just a profound sense of accomplishment, and beyond that, the first stirrings of excitement about what might come next. The world, she realized, had just gotten much bigger, and she was ready to explore it. News of Lynn's breakthrough spread through the mathematics department like wildfire. By the end of the week, professors from other universities were calling Dr. Williams and Professor Rivera, requesting more information about the undergraduate student who had supposedly solved the Reichman conjecture. Graduate students whispered in the hallways when Lynn passed by, and even students from other departments began to recognize her. Is it true? A physics major asked Lynn in the library one afternoon. Did you really solve that famous math problem? Lynn, who had been trying to catch up on her neglected coursework, looked up in surprise. How did you hear about that? The student grinned. It's all over the science departments. Some people are saying it's not possible, that the professors must have made a mistake. But Dr. Patel told our quantum mechanics class that your approach is revolutionary. That's the exact word she used. Lynn felt her face grow warm. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. We're still finalizing the proof, she said cautiously. But yes, I think I've found a valid solution. Word continued to spread. The university newspaper ran a front-page story titled, State U Sophomore Solves Impossible Math Problem, complete with a photo of Lynn looking uncomfortable in front of a whiteboard covered with equations. The article quoted Dr. Williams calling her work a once-in-a-generation breakthrough and mentioned potential applications in cryptography and computer science. Lynn's parents were confused at first when she tried to explain what she had accomplished. Her father nodded politely while her mother kept offering her more food, as if solving a famous mathematical problem might have left her particularly hungry. But what does it mean? Her mother asked finally. Will this help you get a good job after graduation? Lynn smiled. Yes, Mom. It will definitely help with that. It wasn't until the local Chinese language newspaper picked up the story that her parents began to understand the significance. The article explained the Reichman conjecture in accessible terms and compared Lynn to famous Chinese mathematicians throughout history. When her father's regular customers started congratulating him on his daughter's achievement, his chest noticeably puffed with pride. My daughter, he told everyone who entered the small grocery store, is very good at math. Meanwhile, Lynn was working harder than ever. With Professor Rivera's guidance, she was refining her solution into a formal paper for submission to the Journal of Advanced Mathematical Theory. Dr. Patel helped with the sections involving quantum field theory, while Dr. Lee contributed insights on the harmonic theory, connections. Dr. Rodriguez ran additional computational tests to strengthen the empirical evidence for Lynn's approach. The work was exacting and sometimes frustrating. Lynn had to learn the conventions of academic publishing, with its precise formatting and formal language. She spent hours in Professor Rivera's office discussing how to structure the paper and anticipate potential criticisms. We need to be meticulous, Professor Rivera explained. Your solution is unorthodox enough that it will face extra scrutiny. We can't afford any weak points that critics could use to dismiss your work. As the paper took shape, Dr. Williams began making arrangements for Lynn to present at the International Mathematics Conference in Chicago. It would be her first time speaking at a professional conference, and what a debut it would be. We'll be presenting in the main hall, Dr. Williams told her. Attendance is by invitation only, but for this, let's just say there's considerable interest in what you have to say. Lynn felt a flutter of panic at the thought of presenting her work to an audience of the world's leading mathematicians.
What if they find a mistake?
What if I can't answer their questions? That's why we prepare, Professor Rivera said firmly. By the time you step on that stage, you'll know this material better than anyone alive. The weeks leading up to the conference were a blur of preparation. Lynn practiced her presentation daily, first with her professors and then before audiences of graduate students and faculty. Tasha helped her shop for professional clothes and listened patiently, while Lynn rehearsed her talk for the dozenth time. "You've got this," Tasha reassured her. "And hey, no matter what happens in Chicago, you've already done something amazing." 2 days before they were scheduled to leave for the conference, Lynn was working late in the mathematics building when Professor Rivera called her into his office. His expression was grave. "There's something you should know," he said, gesturing for her to sit down. "Dr. Voss from Cambridge University has published a paper claiming your approach to the Reichman conjecture is fundamentally flawed." Lynn felt the blood drain from her face. "What, how?" "We've checked everything so carefully." Professor Rivera handed her a printout of the paper. "Dr. Voss is one of the leading experts on the Reichman conjecture. She's been working on it for over 40 years. According to this, she believes your application of quantum field theory to prime number distribution contains a critical error." Lynn scanned the paper with growing dismay. Dr. Eleanor Voss, a mathematician whose work Lynn had studied extensively, had written a detailed critique of the approach described in the preliminary announcement of Lynn's findings. The paper was filled with complex mathematical arguments and concluded that the purported solution fails to account for critical boundary conditions in nonlinear prime distribution spaces. "But that's not right," Lynn said, looking up from the paper. "We specifically addressed those boundary conditions in Section 4 of our draft." "Yes, we did," Professor Rivera agreed. "But Dr. Voss is responding to the announcement, not our full paper, which hasn't been published yet. She's making assumptions about your approach based on limited information." "So what do we do?" Lynn asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "The conference is in 2 days. We continue as planned," Professor Rivera said firmly. "Your solution is sound. Dr. Voss is a respected mathematician, but she's also someone who has spent much of her career trying to solve this same problem. It's not surprising that she might be resistant to a solution from an unexpected source." Lynn looked down at the paper again. "She says my approach demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of prime number theory, and that it's mathematically naive." The word stung more than Lynn wanted to admit. "Dr. Voss hasn't seen your full proof," Professor Rivera reminded her, "and she certainly hasn't had the benefit of Dr. Patel's insights on the quantum aspects of your work. At the conference, you'll have the opportunity to address these criticisms directly." Lynn nodded, but the confidence she'd been building over the past weeks had been shaken. What if Dr. Voss was right? What if there was a fundamental flaw in her approach that all of them had missed? That night, Lynn barely slept. She reviewed her work obsessively, checking and rechecking the sections Dr. Voss had criticized. By morning, she was exhausted but convinced that her solution remained valid. Dr. Voss had made assumptions about her approach that simply weren't accurate. The flight to Chicago the next day was a tense affair. Dr. Williams had arranged for Lynn, Professor Rivera, and Dr. Patel to travel together. They used the time to prepare for potential challenges to Lynn's work, with Dr. Patel focusing particularly on the quantum field aspects that Dr. Voss had criticized. "Eleanor Voss is brilliant in her field," Dr. Patel said, "but quantum field theory isn't her specialty. She's approaching your work from a purely mathematical perspective, without fully understanding the physics behind it." Lynn appreciated the reassurance, but the knot in her stomach only tightened as they approached Chicago. By the time they checked into their hotel near the conference center, she was so anxious she could barely eat. "Try to get some rest," Professor Rivera advised her. "Tomorrow will be challenging enough without the added burden of exhaustion."